I like this thing. Good afternoon, good evening. How's the camera working? Okay? All right, very good. I'm going to read the speech because I don't ad lib well. I'd like to thank Eric and for facilitating my talk, for inviting me to speak to you today. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. The occasion, other than my being here in Norway, but the occasion for my talk is the publication of the English version of my book, Khrushchev Lied, the subtitle of which is The Evidence That Every Revelation, with quotation marks, of Stalin's and Beria's crimes in Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25th, 1956, is provably false. This book is a revised and updated version of the Russian edition of the book, which was published in December 2007 by Algorithm Publishers in Moscow, under the title Anti-Stalinskaya Podlost, which roughly translated means anti-Stalinist villainy. I didn't pick the title. And it was republished in October of last year, 2010, under the title Tayny 20-го съезда, or Secrets of the 20th Congress. It's a much better title. There are 16,500 copies of this book in Russian in print now, and most of them have been sold. In Russia, as in the West, Khrushchev is an official hero. Students in Russia study Khrushchev's secret speech because it is a turning point in Soviet and therefore in Russian history. It was also a turning point in world history. But outside of Russia, very few people now read this long speech because it's full of references to people and events that they've never heard of. For that reason, I'm also going to briefly mention some other issues in Soviet history that are far better known than the ones Khrushchev mentions in this talk. Evidence and research are basically what I have to offer here. And there are very few people doing the work that I do. Almost everyone else who is researching the Stalin period in the Soviet Union, and who can read Russian fluently, as I can, and who has the research skills, and who has an institutional affiliation, like a university, that can provide them with library facilities and vital and very expensive interlibrary loan facilities, and who has the interest and motivation to do this kind of research, almost everybody else is an anti-communist and lacks all objectivity. I'll say more about objectivity later on. You all understanding me, comrades? Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. Give me a signal if I speak too fast. Thank you. The few who do have access to these facilities and are not anti-communists are for the most part in the field of Soviet or Russian history themselves. And in that field, that academic field, it's a basic requirement that you be an anti-communist. In the very few instances where that is not so, you simply have to steer clear of writing anything that will upset, much less contradict, the anti-communists, because the anti-communists dominate this field. I have been told by two fine researchers in Soviet history, researchers who are not leftists, but who strive to be objective, you'd say honest bourgeois historians, that no book that is not hostile to Stalin can be published by an academic publisher. That is certainly true in the West, and I believe it to be true in Russia as well. Let me put it another way to you. If you were in the field of Soviet history, let's say if you taught history, Soviet history in a history department in a university, you could not do the research that I do. If you did, you could not be published in the standard journals or by mainstream academic publishers. And you would soon not be in the field of Soviet history anymore because you must publish in these journals in order to keep your job, so therefore you would not be able to keep your job. That's why my position is unusual. I teach in an English department. My academic livelihood does not depend in any way on my research into Soviet history. I have recently been informed by the provost of my university that I will never be promoted, but at least they're not threatening my job, okay? I'm not doing this for promotion anyway. So it's this that I have to offer you. And a lot of people around the world think this research is important. Not just people on the left, such as we are. The anti-communists also think it's important, and they don't like it. This research is the reason I was attacked by David Horowitz in 2005 and 2006. It's the reason that the chief conservative columnist for the largest newspaper in the state of New Jersey, the Star-Ledger of Newark, devoted 2 of his columns in 2005 to attacking me, comparing me to unfavorably to a Nazi professor who had just been found out at another university and had just been fired. A lot of people on the right do not wish the truth about the history of the communist movement in the Soviet Union during the Stalin years to come to light. They want to continue to demonize it, to compare it to Hitler and fascism, and to lie about it. And that's what they do, not only passively through their point of view or bias, but actively by deliberately falsifying the evidence, sources, and history. So what I have to offer is a corrective to all of this, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. When preparing this talk for a group in New York City in April, I asked what kinds of historical questions I should speak about. My host replied, basically, we think it would be good if you could talk about a few major examples of Khrushchev's lies, maybe the allegations that Stalin had Kirov murdered. And he also said, I think the questions of research and evidence, while important, are somewhat secondary to the facts, particularly for our group since we are basically a political and not an academic organization. I told him at that time that I must disagree in part. Facts cannot be separated from research and evidence. It's through research and evidence that we establish what is factual and what isn't. There isn't any other way. It was through forbidding research and withholding evidence that Khrushchev was able to get away with his lies for over 50 years. And Khrushchev enabled all the Cold War anti-communists, whether in the Soviet Union, like Roy Medvedev, for example, or in the West, like Robert Conquest, and many others. Khrushchev-era falsifications continue to enable the mainstream voices in Soviet history today. That's the origin of most of the lies that you read about. I ought to tell you a little about myself and where I'm coming from. My first field of specialization is medieval studies. I was trained to do deeply historical research. For example, to use primary sources in languages other than English. Never to rely on received knowledge or received opinion. Not to trust the opinions of recognized authorities. To check every reference, every footnote for myself. Let me say a word about objectivity. Objectivity as a scientific method has been accurately termed a practice of distrust of the self. One can learn to be objective by training oneself to become aware of, to articulate, and then to doubt one's own views. One must automatically be suspicious of evidence that tends to confirm one's own preconceived ideas, prejudices, and preferences. One must learn to give an especially generous reading, to search especially hard for, to lean over backwards to consider evidence and arguments that contradict one's own biases. Excuse me. This is all elementary stuff. Everybody knows it. Objectivity is a practice, like learning a foreign language. You can become good at it through practice by deliberate effort. Moreover, you must do this if you want to learn the truth. And we Marxists want to learn the truth. Isn't that true? Marx and Engels wrote that, quote, "The proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains." By that, I assume they meant that we have no sacred cows, nothing we refuse to subject to critical scrutiny. We want to cast aside all illusions and falsehoods. Only the truth shall make us free, if we are against all exploitation of man by man. if we are the international working class. Marx's favorite slogan was De omnibus dubitandum, question everything. And that means to question your own preconceived ideas and biases above all others. If you want to learn the truth, that's what you must do. Moreover, it is what every bourgeois detective in every bourgeois detective story knows. As Sherlock Holmes used to say, keep your mind free of precipitate conclusions. That means hasty conclusions, right? Get the facts before you form your hypotheses. Most important, be ready to abandon an hypothesis that does not explain the established facts. If you don't do this, if you don't try to discover the truth from the outset, then you're not going to stumble across the truth by accident on the way. And what you will find will not be the truth. This is what I try hard to do. None of the demonizers of Stalin and the Soviet Union, you know the word demonizers, the critics of Stalin and the Soviet Union, the anti-communist experts on the history of the communist movement, can honestly say this. They do not make any attempt to be objective. They do not discover the truth then because they do not want to do so. They want to write propaganda with footnotes. That's what I call it, right? Propaganda with footnotes. And that's what their works are. A little history. As a graduate student, this is about me. As a graduate student from 1965 to 1969, I opposed the United States war in Vietnam. At some point, somebody told me that the Vietnamese communists could not be the good guys because they were led by Ho Chi Minh, who had been trained by Stalin. And Stalin, he said, Stalin had killed millions of innocent people. I remembered this remark. It was probably the reason that in the early 1970s, I read the first edition of Robert Conquest's book, which is titled The Great Terror, when it was published. I'm sure it's in Norwegian or Swedish or Danish, for sure. I was shaken by what I read. I should add that I could read the Russian language since I had already been studying Russian literature since high school. So I studied Conquest's book very carefully later when I had some time. Using the resources of the Slavic Room at the New York Public Library, in New York City, and occasionally using interlibrary loan, I checked every one of his more than 1,000 footnotes. Apparently, no one else had ever done this. I discovered that Conquest had no source criticism at all. Also, I discovered that his footnotes did not support his anti-Stalin conclusions. Conquest used any source that was hostile to Stalin, regardless of whether it was reliable or not. Anything on paper. Eventually, I decided to write something about the so-called terror. It took a long time, but in 1988, I finally published an article titled New Light on Old Stories About Marshal Tukhachevsky, Some Documents Reconsidered. It's on my website, which I'll write on the board later on. During this time, I studied the research being done by the new school of academic historians of the Soviet Union. The school of which I speak arose as the antithesis to Conquest and to the totalitarian conception of Sovietology in the Cold War period. By carefully studying the evidence already available, and this was in the 1980s when not much evidence was available, and most important, by trying hard to be objective, the researchers of this new school were already showing that all the Cold War, Trotskyist, Khrushchevite, and later the Gorbachev-Yeltsin history was fatally compromised by political bias. These works had managed to so compromise their work by their political prejudices that their books should be viewed not as history, but as examples of propaganda. In the world of scientific history, the 1986 book, The Origins of the Great Purges by Arch Getty, one of the founders of this new school, became a genuine sensation. In it, Getty successfully disproved a large number of falsehoods that had been accepted as true. This included, among other things, the notion that the repressions of the 1930s had been actions planned in advance by Stalin. It was Getty's misfortune that his work was published in the United States during the years of perestroika. During this time, under the false cover of glasnost, or openness, only the works of the Cold Warriors were published, and those were published in huge editions in Russia. How could Russian readers find out about the pioneering works of Getty or Robert Thurston if none of their books on Russian history has ever been published in Russia itself? The same situation holds in the case of most of the historians whose names I referred to above. But fortunately, there are also more encouraging examples. 2 years ago, a Ukrainian internet magazine published one of the excellent works by Professor Mark Tauger of the University of West Virginia. Tauger's work utterly disproves the Nazi-inspired myth that the famine of 1932-33 was a holodomor, or man-made famine carried out by Soviet leaders. Anyway, back to Khrushchev's speech. The closed, or as it is called in the West, the secret report of Khrushchev's is without exaggeration one of the most influential speeches of the 20th century. It fundamentally changed the path of Soviet, and in fact of world history. It's significant that precisely this speech has become one of the pillars of the political conception of anti-Stalinism, the foundational source for which can be called the paradigm of the 20th Congress. In short, no one interested in the history of the Soviet Union can ignore a document of such importance. When I was forming a conception of this work, my goal was much more modest. I wanted to place the revelations in the report alongside the historical sources that have been made public thanks to the declassification of some documents from the former Soviet archives in Russia. This kind of research could in principle be done by a Russian historian, or for that matter, a Chinese historian. For during the past 20 years, a large number of new sources have been made available to scholars that make possible an objective evaluation of the statements in Khrushchev's speech. And at this point, a curious picture began to emerge. For as it turned out of all the so-called revelations affirmed in that report by Khrushchev, that I could verify, not one of them turned out to be true. Not a single one. A few of Khrushchev's falsehoods were, of course, known earlier, such as his absurd declaration that Stalin, quote, planned military operations on a globe. But that the entire speech was made up of so-called revelations like this one, that was astonishing, and I was astonished. I would like to say something about the question of defending Stalin. I am often called a Stalinist. I reject this term. I am not defending Stalin or anyone else. As a researcher and a scholar, I deal with facts and evidence. I agree with Russian researcher Yuri Zhukov when he wrote, this is a quote, "I can honestly tell you that I oppose the rehabilitation of Stalin because I oppose rehabilitations in general. Nothing and no one in history should be rehabilitated. But we must uncover the truth and speak the truth. Nor do I wish to suggest that, if only Stalin had had his way, the manifold problems of building socialism and communism in the Soviet Union would have thereby been solved." So I chose to research the report that supposedly uncovered the crimes of Stalin and Beria. I isolated 61 so-called revelations or accusatory assertions. I researched each one of them in the light of the historical sources now available from the former Soviet archives. The end result was that in Khrushchev's secret speech, not a single one of such so-called revelations turned out to be true. There is no question here of defending Stalin. Not one of the revelatory assertions of the secret speech can withstand a confrontation with the evidence. Like it or not, in view of the historical evidence presented in my book, Khrushchev Lied, it is impossible to view the history of the Soviet Union in the distorted mirror of the secret speech anymore. A few words about the implications. Yuri Zhukov described the archival situation this way. This is the adventure of the archives, the Soviet archives in Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Quote, "With the beginning of perestroika, one of the slogans of which was glasnost, or openness, the Kremlin archive, formerly closed to researchers, was liquidated. Its holdings began to be relocated in various public archives. This process began but was not completed. Without any publicity or explanation of any kind, in 1996, the most important, pivotal materials were again reclassified. This is in Russia now. Hidden away in the archive of the President of the Russian Federation. Soon the reasons for this secretive operation became very clear. It permitted the resurrection of one of the two old and very shabby myths. By these myths, Zhukov means, of course, the myth of Stalin the genius, the great genius, but specifically the myth of Stalin the villain. That was the myth, the aim that the government of Russia aimed to reconstruct. Only the first of these myths is familiar to readers of Western and anti-communist historiography. Arch Getty, the historian at UCLA I referred to before, has called the historical research done during the period of the Cold War, quote, products of propaganda, research which it makes no sense to criticize or to try to correct in its individual parts, but which must be done all over again from the beginning. I agree with Getty and would add that this tendentious, politically charged, and dishonest research is still being produced today. The rediscovery of Soviet history goes far beyond the critique of Khrushchev's secret speech. Everything that passes not just for common knowledge, but for expert knowledge about the Stalin period is fundamentally false. That is, I speak to other professional historians of the Soviet Union, those who will speak to me, and they also have been duped or taken in by a great deal of this research. To paraphrase Weird Al Yankovic, do you all know Weird Al Yankovic here? Okay. He has a song called Everything That You Know Is Wrong. So, to paraphrase Weird Al Yankovic, everything you know about the Stalin period in the Soviet Union is wrong. All of Soviet history needs to be rewritten. A few examples. Collectivization. Collectivization solved the eternal problem of recurrent crop failures and famines. Until 1932-1933, there had been a famine every 2 or 3 years in Russia and the Ukraine for a millennium, for 1,000 years. This is well documented by bourgeois scholarship. Thanks to the collectivization, the famine of 1932-1933 was the last one, except for the famine of 46-47, which was caused both by the huge destruction of the war plus bad weather. It was bad weather in Western Europe too, but there the Marshall Plan helped out. Collectivization also saved Europe from the Nazis. Without it, rapid industrialization and a modern Red Army would have been impossible. The Nazis would have conquered the USSR and had its immense natural and human resources to turn against the Allies. The Japanese would have had access to the oil of Sakhalin in their Pacific War. Tens of millions more people would probably have been killed. I've spent a good deal of time and effort studying the question of opposition conspiracies during the 1930s. My Moscow-based colleague Vladimir Bobrov and I have published a number of articles on them. Much more is yet to come. The opposition conspiracies alleged by the Moscow trials did exist. The Moscow trial defendants were guilty of at least what they confessed to. In a few cases, like that of Bukharin, we know now that they were guilty of more than they confessed to. Another example, Leon Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Germans and Japanese on the evidence. Likewise, the Trotsky archives, these are the ones in the United States, although I'm here partially to study the Trotsky archives at the two major archives in Oslo, the Riksarkivet and the Arbeiderbevegelsesarkiv in downtown, in Youngsgate, okay? I'll be going there tomorrow. The various Trotsky archives around the world hold documents that show that Trotsky and his son, Leon Sedov, discussed what lies they were going to tell to the Dewey Commission and in their writings. They discussed this in letters amongst each other. The so-called Great Terror was deliberately caused by Nikolai Yezhov, who was head of the NKVD, who killed several 100,000 Soviet citizens in 1937, 1938, in an attempt to sow discontent with the Soviet government and help open the door for a German or Japanese invasion. And by the way, we know there were two Japanese invasions, right? One in 1938 and one in 1939. If you know your Soviet history, you'll remember those. So that was a serious matter. Let me see where I am here. The military conspiracies were genuine. More about that in a minute. The Soviet Union did not invade Poland in 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not divide up Poland, much less Europe. It also enabled the Allied victory in World War II. I have a lengthy article with 17 pages of documentary evidence on my webpage on this topic. The Nazi propaganda version that the Soviets shot 14,000 or 22,000 or however many Polish prisoners of war at Katyn in 1940 has been seriously challenged. There is good evidence that the so-called smoking gun documents, the ones presented by Yeltsin to the Polish Prime Minister in 1991 and then since then published all over the world, there's good evidence that they are forgeries. The only source in English for information about this fascinating Katyn massacre historical question, one in which the evidence is still being uncovered, is my webpage on the subject. On my home page, whose URL I'll give you later on, or if I forget, somebody will give it to you. I have a web page, a link there to my webpage on the Katyn massacre mystery. I also have articles, some shorter, others longer, and with fuller documentation about all the issues that I have just mentioned above. Since the host of my recent talk in New York City explicitly mentioned the allegation that Khrushchev had Sergei Kirov murdered on December 1st, 1934, let me say a few words about this question. This is the Kirov murder. Again, those who are somewhat familiar with Soviet history will know at least what I'm talking about. It sort of kicked off the Moscow trials. Khrushchev wished to prove that Stalin had had Kirov killed. This was part of his plan to declare all the defendants at the Moscow trials innocent. He only just begins to do this in the secret speech in 1956, but continued and did much more later on. Eventually, Khrushchev's top-level commission found, to their disappointment, that Stalin did not kill Kirov. There was just no evidence for it. But they could not or did not want to contradict Khrushchev's basic historical paradigm, so they concluded that Leonid Nikolaev, who was the person who did shoot Kirov and was caught on the spot, was a, quote, lone gunman. Stalin, therefore, must have had everybody else framed. They then went on to declare all the Moscow trials to be frame-ups and all the defendants to be innocent. This became the basic story for the Western anti-communists, as well as for Roy Medvedev and the Soviet Khrushchevite anti-communists. Then Robert Conquest picked it up back in the 1970s. Conquest and others eventually returned to the story that Stalin must have killed Kirov. Conquest and Amy Knight, another Western anti-communist researcher, wrote books to so-called prove this. Interesting to read because there's no evidence of it at all. Gorbachev's men wanted to prove it too. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's right-hand man in the Politburo, tried hard to encourage Gorbachev's rehabilitation commissions and Politburo researchers to prove it. We have the documents, they're published. But they were unable to do so. Eventually, they too fell back on the Khrushchev-era conclusion that Nikolaev was a so-called lone gunman, and Stalin had framed everybody, like the evil guy they wanted him to be. This is the position assumed, not proven, not even argued, but assumed by Alla Kirillina, the main Russian authority on Kirov and the Kirov assassination. She was the curator of the Kirov Museum in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, for many years, and she published her book in the 1990s and again in 2001. This past September 2010, Matthew Leno, a professor of Russian history at the University of Rochester, published an 800-page book in the Yale University Press series, Annals of Communism. The book is titled The Kirov Murder and Soviet History. Lino has spent the last decade writing this book. He had very broad, though not total, access to Soviet archives, stuff that nobody else has seen. Certainly no one else has published. It is meant to be the last word on the subject. In it, Lino claims that he has proven the Khrushchev-Gorbachev Karelina hypothesis, that Nikolaev was a lone gunman and that Stalin framed everybody. I'm in the final stage right now, back home, of a book-length project that begins with a detailed dissection of Lino's book and goes on to consider all the evidence that Lino never considers, either dismisses or ignores entirely without even telling his readers that it exists, because he does that, right? He just leaves out the evidence that's inconvenient, and unless you're very knowledgeable about this field, you don't know what's left out, right? Bias by omission is a very powerful means of biasing any argument. Well, I can tell you there is no doubt that Lino is completely wrong. We have a huge amount of evidence now that proves that the men convicted and executed along with Nikolaev in December 1934 were in fact guilty of conspiring to assassinate Kirov. More than that, we have a huge amount of evidence that the accused in the Moscow trials, right, the three big Moscow trials of August 1936, January 1937, and March 1938, all three of them, the defendants were also guilty. Guilty not just of what they confessed to, but also of crimes to which they did not confess, but which have come to light later on, thanks to these partial revelations from the Soviet archives. The same is true of the military men convicted in the so-called Tukhachevsky affair, 1937. We now possess a large amount of evidence of their guilt as well. Their innocence is asserted by every authority in the field of Soviet history, Russian, American, European, all of them. But the evidence tells the story. My colleague Vladimir and I have done much research on this as well. It's harder to get that kind of stuff published because these are the ancestors of the military leaders of Russia, and the Russian government doesn't really want to mess with that very much. But back to the Kirov assassination. Matthew Lino, the gentleman I told you, who the professor at Rochester who just wrote this 800-page book, does not even mention much of this evidence, undoubtedly because it contradicts his own preconceived idea that Nikolaev was a lone gunman. My point is this: that has to be Lino's conclusion, because it is the only conclusion acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Just like the conclusion that the Soviets shot all the Polish prisoners of war in cold blood is the only version of the Katyn massacre acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Do I have time to tell a 1-minute story here? Okay, well, last October 2010, right? A Russian politician published on the internet a number of documents which seem to be rough drafts used by the forgers who forged the documents, the smoking gun documents proving, that the Katyn massacre was committed by the Soviets. He published the rough drafts. He said that one of the forgers had kept this material, come forward to him, on a sort of nationalist basis, ashamed of himself now, and he published them on the internet. So there is an academic mailing list for specialists in Soviet history. It's run by the University of Michigan. It's called H-Russia, H-Russia. They have a lot of academic mailing lists. And this is used by historians of the Soviet Union worldwide, okay? So I put together a little post citing this material, all right? And I didn't think that the moderator of the list would even let me mention it. But for some reason or other, she mentioned it. She posted my post. The outrage among the anti-communists was so ferocious that she resigned from being the moderator of the list They still haven't appointed another one yet. And the whole list was sort of like turned upside down, right? Because you can't say in polite company that the Russians, the Soviets, didn't kill the Polish prisoners at Katyn. That's fundamental to modern post-1989 anti-communist Polish nationalism, right? That's one of the bedrock foundations of Polish nationalism. It's not illegal to say it in Poland, as it, until recently, was illegal to say in Ukraine that the famine of 1932-1933 was not a holodomor, not a deliberate attempt to starve the Ukrainian people. Up until the election of the new Ukrainian prime minister about a year ago, it was illegal. You could be prosecuted in Ukraine for denying that, right? Then the new prime minister came in. He was a little bit more pro-Russian, still not a good guy, but he's pro-Russian, and he said, well, we can't do that, all right? But it's completely unacceptable in Poland today, and among anti-communists generally, to say that, hey, you know, maybe the Soviets didn't kill the Poles at Katyn. We have all this evidence now. Well, as I said, it caused such a hubbub that they had to shut the list down for a while, and the moderator resigned. That's the kind of attempt at policing or censorship of the truth that goes on in the professional field of Soviet studies, okay? It's a good example. Lino and Kirillina hide the truth from their readers about the Kirov assassination. They hide the evidence that contradicts their conclusions. You can only learn about this evidence if you spend a lot of time, effort, and money identifying, locating, obtaining, and studying it. That's what I'm doing. I cite these examples to illustrate how completely fraudulent the canonical or mainstream history of the Soviet Union has been and remains today. And this history is canonical and mainstream, not just for pro-capitalist anti-communists, but for almost all of the left as well. If you take a course on Soviet history, I don't know anything about Norway, right? But if you take a course on Soviet history in Norway, you're going to get the anti-communist mainstream version of Soviet history. I can guarantee it, all right? Because that's the only one that they teach. Maybe there's one or two professors someplace else, you know, but basically that's what you're going to get. And it's false. The political forces that promoted first a greater role for the market in Soviet society, and then the wholesale return to super-exploitative capitalism in the Soviet Union, are the same ones who demonized Stalin in the Stalin years. They also sponsored the research or propaganda that spreads this version of history, which is the mainstream version in Russia as it is elsewhere. I want to take 60 seconds to mention a fine Russian researcher, a young man, well, he's relatively young, he was born in 1967. Does that make him young? To me, that's young, okay? I know to some of you that's your great-grandfather, but to me, that's still young. There's a man named Igor Pikhalov. He joined the Soviet Communist Party in the late 80s, and then when he saw what was happening, Gorbachev and stuff, he quit. And now I think he belongs to one of the Russian Communist parties. But the main thing about him is he's a really good researcher. He's published a bunch of very good books on Soviet history of the Stalin period. Unfortunately, they're all in Russian at this point, all right? Because that stuff doesn't get translated, right? Only the right-wing stuff gets translated. The good stuff never gets translated. I want to mention him because of this. I identify with him to the degree that I'm familiar with him because he's always called a Stalinist because, you know, he also writes these books disproving lies about the Stalin period and Stalin, all right? Books and articles. Back in 2004, and he says, I'm not a Stalinist, although I think he's kind of given up because it's become hopeless. But he isn't. And here's how you know. Back in 2004, he wrote an article on the Kirov assassination. This was after Alla Kirillina's book came out. And he wrote this article. It's not a very long article, and clearly he didn't go into it with a lot of depth, which is what I'm doing, right? He was doing military stuff at that point. But he comes to the conclusion at the end. He says, well, it does look like Stalin framed these people. Now, he likes Stalin, okay? He's a Stalin guy. But he comes to this conclusion, Stalin framed these people. So my colleague in Russia, in Moscow, Vladimir Bobrov, is in touch with him. Pikhalov lives in St. Petersburg. Bobrov, my colleague, lives in Moscow, but they're in touch, all right? So I emailed him. I said, first thing I want you to know is, because I'm doing this research, is that Pikala was wrong. Okay? This was not a frame-up. All of these people were guilty. There's lots of evidence. The second thing is, I want you to praise him. All right? Because this proves that he's not a Stalinist. You see, this proves that he's out for the truth. Because here he is, this viewed and in many respects is a sort of champion of Stalin, right? Disproving all these lies. And yet, when he felt that the evidence stated that Stalin framed these other defendants, right? He said it in an article and published it, right? So that's, even though he was mistaken, right? It proves a certain degree of objectivity, of integrity. You see what I mean? He was out after the truth more than he was out after to push the pro-Stalin line. You see what I'm saying? So this is something, of course, you never find among the Trotskyists, never, ever, right? But you also never find it among the anti-communists either, ever. Okay, it's up to us communists to look at the truth, right? Nobody else is going to do it for us. We have to do it for ourselves, okay? I mean, there's people who do helpful things here and there, but you sort of don't know they're helpful until after the fact, until you've gone and verified it. I see you're looking at the clock, so I better hurry up. We got time for another minute or two? Yeah. Okay, good. So, okay, that was my bit about Igor Pikala, whom none of you know, and, unless lightning strikes twice in the same place, you probably never will read him because his stuff hasn't been translated into English. But there are people out there, like us, okay, others who are interested in the truth. And it's certainly not just me. Soviet history is still mainly propaganda. The historiography of the Soviet Union has been dominated by propaganda from the beginning, right? From the day after the revolution. But the propaganda came to predominate during the post-World War II Cold War period. During the past decade, I've spent a great deal of time, and also money, acquiring and studying the documents from former Soviet archives that have been released since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. I've confined my study to those documents that deal with the Stalin period, and within that period, I've mainly concentrated on the 1930s. That's because if you don't concentrate, you never can go into depth, So I've also studied a great many secondary sources by well-known experts in this period in Russia and the West. All of the most famous voices and controlling influences in Soviet history are anti-communist ideologues who misuse historical science in the interest of demonizing Stalin, the Stalin period, and the project of communism. This is not only a matter of political bias, though there's plenty of that. There's a great deal also of deliberate falsification, provable outright lying in works by famous historians of the Soviet Union. Full professors at all the universities you can name, right? Harvard and Yale and Cambridge and Oxford and right down the line. Provable lies. I demonstrate in my book that Khrushchev used a number of different methods of what I call prevarication, which is a fancy Latin word meaning lie, because, when a friend of mine read the manuscript, one of the drafts, I went through like dozens of drafts of this book, she said, you use the word lie too much. You got to find another word for lie. I said, but they're always lying. She said, well, get out the thesaurus. You know what a thesaurus is, right? Gives you all the synonyms. So I became very familiar with the synonyms for lying, right? Prevarication is a good one. I like that. Okay, makes you sound like you're learned, right? Prevarication. Okay, but it's true. The most common form of these means of prevarication and misdirection of all, 40 out of the 61 so-called revelations are provable, deliberate lies by Khrushchev. Okay? The same thing is true about the works of many of the most famous academic historians of the USSR today, both Western and Russian. Because this talk is being taped, I won't mention any names so that you all are not sued, okay? I want to get you into trouble, more trouble than you're going to be in anyway for being revolutionary communists. So you should be in trouble for that. That's good to be in trouble for that, but not for other nonsense. Evidence. At some point, I teach. Now, I teach literature, but literature has to do with research too. At some point in every class I teach, I ask the students, quote, what is the most radical word in any language? So I get a number of common answers. Among the most frequent answers are socialism, communism, right? Radical words, right? Then I say something like this. Socialism and communism are good radical words, Very good. But my vote is for a different word. My vote is for the word evidence. Ask for evidence everywhere and always, and people will be calling you a communist soon enough. This is nowhere more true than in the study of the history of the communist movement. Lies predominate, and when you probe for the evidence that supposedly supports these lies, that's when things start to get interesting. Karl Marx discovered the evidence. Remember Marx? Yeah. He discovered the evidence that capitalism is based on exploitation and that its overthrow is inevitable. This is the first example of why communists insist on discovering the truth, because the truth is on our side, the side of the exploited working class of the world. I am often told, Grover, that's my name, Grover, I don't find your arguments persuasive. You don't persuade me. My response usually goes like this. Persuasion is a form of propaganda or public relations. Persuasion depends on the mindset of the person you are trying to persuade. Upton Sinclair, who's a great American writer who for much of his life was a radical, right? Upton Sinclair. He wrote The Jungle, okay. Upton Sinclair once wrote, quote, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." That's a great quote. A person with very fixed preconceived ideas cannot be, quote, persuaded by any evidence, no matter how good it is. Likewise, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get a person to look at the evidence in an objective manner, when doing so will force him to confront the possibility that his most cherished prejudices and preconceived ideas are wrong. His peace of mind, the fellowship of his friends, maybe even his job, depends upon his worshiping the, quote, common knowledge, what Francis Bacon, the 17th century English writer, called the idols of the tribe. You're about to bow to the idols of the tribe. Which always and everywhere mean the ideas of the exploiters, right? Those are the ideas that you can get promoted by promoting those ideas. And if you attack those ideas, you won't get promoted. But I can tell you this. I make many of my most interesting discoveries, not by having a nose like a bloodhound for mystery, but by following up the footnotes in the works of academic secondary sources, checking to see whether the primary sources, the documents cited in those notes, really provide evidence for the statements or fact claims that are made. Very often I discover that they don't. The evidence cited does not prove the fact claim made. So my method is basically just follow the evidence. Just keep on following the evidence and don't settle for anything less. The Cold War paradigm has been the prevailing view of the history of the Stalin years. The research reported on here can contribute, I hope, towards a clearing of the ground, a beginning all over again from the beginning. The truth that finally emerges will also have great meaning for the great Marxist project, our project, of understanding the world in order to change it, of building a classless society of social and economic justice. Thank you.